And the panel, I'd like to welcome Annette Schaefer, Managing Director at Big Picture, who's going to come back up and chair the panel. And we're looking at how we increase the addressable market for streamed TV services.
Oh, great. Thank you.
That's okay.
Thank you very much. And
Can I ask introduce you to my panel, Pierre Adrian, from Switzerland. Howells, who is the chair and promotion community model for DVB project. And last but not least, Martin Webb from Comcast Technology Solutions. Before we kick off the discussion, I would have a short intro, each of you. Why are you here, or what drives you in increasing the addressable market for streamed TV services? What are your roles and what are you currently up to? I mean, we had this fireside chat already, Pierre Adrian, but I think it would be good to give the audience a little bit about your background and what you're doing in the companies.
Do you want to go first?
Yes,
yep,
please.
Perfect. So yes, Martin Webb. I'm the Senior Product Manager for our Cloud TV solution at Comcast Technology Solutions. So the key focus for our solution is very much on enabling digital transformation. And that's something we see as happening in two phases. The first phase really was about online services being a bolt-on to the existing business. And then in that stage, really just getting something going was the key challenge. But as we progress, as things really start getting interesting when we get to that second stage of digital transformation. And for us, that is when organizations pivot to start thinking about online from a digital first perspective. I don't necessarily mean that from the perspective of putting digital first. I mean thinking about digital from the outset of the strategy, building that into the core. And so that really enables some of the new concepts that we're talking about. And in order to get there, what we would advocate is the need for flexibility. And the only real way to get flexibility is through cloud-based TV platforms driven by an architecture using services, not just for scalability, but for flexibility. And that's really where we start getting into our thoughts on today's panel. Increasing the TAM for streaming services is really about improving the connections between content and consumers, the engagement with consumers with your content, monetizing that and achieving all of that at scale. And so I think those are the key points that really will help drive the TAM in this market.
Thanks, Martin. Elwood or Pierre?
Please. So my name is Elwood Howells. I'm the chair of the PCM, the Promotions and Communications module of DVB. So I hope that all of you know who DVB are, but just in case, it's where standards for digital television have been put together since 1993. We are a group of over 200 or so members, including people like Google and Netflix, not just traditional broadcasters such as BBC, Sky, BT, etc. So all the broadcasters are there, many streamers are there, all the TV manufacturers are there. And actually, traditionally we've developed standards for linear broadcast television, but over the last 5 or 10 years we've been developing standards for primarily linear, not necessarily, streaming as well. So streaming is our focus at the moment, not because we don't like broadcast. It's really because the specs for broadcast, standardization for broadcast is very mature. It's very well done. It's very easy to pick up the DVB book and set up a broadcast channel based on that. For streaming, it's a bit more nuanced, less standardized. But I think that DVB has already made great strides in changing that and making it much easier, much more standardized to deliver streaming content. Myself, I represent Huawei HiSilicon at DVB, so that's my member, if you like, the member that I work for. And I also run my own company called Macroblock Consulting.
Thanks, Elwood.
Yeah, for the ones who weren't here in our previous session, my name is Pierre Adrian. I lead the streaming service of the public service broadcaster in Switzerland. It's called Play Suisse. Plenty of challenges regarding our addressable market.
Thank you. Yeah, what we learned this morning so far is that streaming is getting bigger, and we are actually all asking ourselves how big can it get? We learned from the numbers from the market research that it will overtake broadcast television sometime, but it still will run in parallel. But how do we maximize the total addressable market? I mean, we always talk about wallet share and market reach, but also the consumers can only spend certain amounts per month, so it will be taken out of the pay TV bucket or spending, so to speak. But in the end of the day, how many different streaming services you can really sell in the market and can resonate with the audience? I think that's one of the key questions that we would like to discuss in this panel, but also how do you can innovate through UX, UI, recommendation, everything to make it much easier for the consumer to find what they really want to watch. I mean, going back to the presentation we had before this panel. So starting off with what is the delivery of economics or the economics of delivery, all of these services, and what are your thoughts to that? I mean, how you go about it and how you compete not only with the locals, but also with the global streamers in these markets, and what can help you to go to market and differentiate there?
Do you want to take that one first? So I think there's some interesting points in the sense of competing with global streamers. I mean, the UK is clearly a very developed market, but what we see in other markets that are a bit less developed is that actually the entrance of the global streamers really drives a revolution in that market in terms of premium content. It creates a rising tide for all boats, in effect. If you think in some markets where before the big streamers have entered, then there can be a much lower emphasis on what we would describe as premium content. And so when those services enter, it drives up the interest in premium content, and that then drives the interest in other key features such as content protection, which enables other services to flourish. So I think that's a key point.
But yeah, to flourish, but also to build what we learned in the session from Pierre Adrian, to build something that specific addresses the audience in the markets. And for all of you who haven't been here in the previous session, it was very interesting to hear from Pierre Adrian that the content in Switzerland, for example, is very important, that it's local content. But I think we talk also about go-to-market and how quick you can go to market and how important that is and what kind of technologies and you need to have in place, but also what are you doing on the UX and innovation, or driving UX and UI innovation, and that I think was also one of the topics that we discussed already. I mean, but it would be good to point out.
Maybe I'll just take a very concrete examples we're currently doing at Play Suisse regarding technical reach. So one of our main partner in the big screen space is the incumbent telecom company. It's called Swisscom. They have 1.5 million households equipped in Switzerland, so it's largely the leader in the market. And when it comes to having our app on Swisscom TV box, basically one of the big roadblock is the login, right? Nobody likes to subscribe to make the login process on the big screen. So we've been working with our UX team to make the login as seamless, as silent as possible. Mm-hmm. And it's a big challenge because it involves not only legal aspects, because then you're thinking about like pulling the address from their database onto your app, so it's pre-filled, then generating a code on behalf of the user, and then with the ability to change it later. How do you manage the consent management? So it's pre-filled and pre-checked from a legal perspective. All of this in order to facilitate the login process on the big screen and go from basically where you are today onto a much bigger proportion of the users, not bouncing when they're opening your app. And that's just a very concrete example of how we try to address with user experience one of the big roadblocks to our addressable market, on the big screen.
So you have seamless as you always say, seamless experience. But what are the other roadblocks? I mean, besides having seamless user applications and finding content wherever you want to watch it, or we learned today that a lot of consumers are using mobile for search, but then watching it in the end on the big screens. But is there any learnings from
discovery is a huge thing. I mean, on an old-fashioned broadcast television, you can switch the on button, press P+ and go through almost all your channels. It's seamless. It's a really nice experience, very simple experience. There's no recommendations as such. Maybe there are, but in its simplest form, it's serendipitous discovery. You flip through, within 1 minute, you found something that you quite like to watch. You can go through 100 channels in 1 minute. So that model hasn't died. I think people still enjoy that experience. They still find things to watch in that way. But for IP-delivered content, that's really hard, right? So typically, you'd switch on your device, go into an app, then you have to first decide which app you're going to go into. Am I going into a super aggregator app? Am I going into the National Broadcasters app? Am I going into a proprietary platform app? One of the major streamers app? You've already made a decision where you've sectioned off, if you like, some of your content. What the DVB has been doing over the last couple of years is to define DVBI. Now, DVBI is a way for you to effectively have a URL, a magic URL, if you like, for any channel. That means that there would be a service list, so you could say, well, just give me all the channels that are here in the UK. And all of them would be in the service list, if you like, or available to find, where you can actually just surf in between them. That's a very powerful model. Then you can build a zapping app, if you like, with recommendations or whatever on top to allow you to discover linear content. On top of that, I think we heard earlier, one of the things which is becoming popular is, well, I'm going to join the live program 5 minutes late and watch it from the beginning. Now, once you grasp the concept of your channel is just a URL effectively, you can then have a +5 minutes, +10, +20 minutes channel if you wish. Or, for example, if it's recorded content, what you could do is pop up a channel, which allows you then to say, well, this is the Doctor Who channel, let's say, right? And when you go there, if you've never been there before, maybe it plays episode 1 of series 1, right? You watch that one. When you go back there the second time, it knows that you've seen the episode 1, and it gives you episode 2. So the channel is effectively starts where you left off. So these things obviously aren't possible on broadcast, but once you start doing that on streaming, and have simple standardized concepts such as DVBI, it allows you to pop up a channel here, have an event just on that channel. That's really hard to do on broadcast, by the way. If you want to pop up a channel, you're probably negotiating with the government for many months before you can put it on air. With DVBI, you have one list. You can pop up a channel. You can have that on there just during the events. We could have had this as a channel on the linear list, and then make it disappear again. So I think there's standardization is important. Making sure that discovery is easy. You can build your app on top of that. I think those are really important concepts.
Can I add to that point? I would say, just on the theme of increasing the addressable market, then really the addressable market is driven by 3 things. It's converting users, retaining users, and increasing viewing time. And within those 3 things, primarily it's engagement that's going to move the needle on all 3 of them. And engagement is such a broad area. I think we often get trapped into thinking just about the algorithms, the recommendation algorithms, and yes, they're vital, but they're the tool to get you to how engagement works. When we talk to customers, we talk about engagement in broad terms, which is, what are your objectives? Well, you're trying to provide a service to end users, so that user wants to be entertained, they want to be made to feel special, they want to have personalized content. So the engagement touches every area. It's not just the sort of, you watched something, now here's something similar. It's how you can build that engagement into the UI, how you can build that into different types of the screens, the pop-up channels, personalized rails, but also other things like push notifications. If you can know when a user is thinking about what to watch that evening, an email is a great way of reaching them, but notifications can really grab them in the moment and spark perhaps a conversation with someone.
And I think the KPIs are pretty clear. It's the lifetime value, or if you're an unpaid service, it's the spent hours or minutes with your service that you measure the success of all of these things you just described that you do to keep the people or keep the customers in service, or to increase the audience reach, but also the content consumption. But I think for a customer it becomes increasingly more challenging, and I like that comparison that Alfred took. So the app becomes a channel and a channel becomes an app. So it is unnoticeable. So you pretty much move from one viewing experience to the next without really noticing what are you currently into, because you're following a content or a certain theme, or you're looking for something. But I think it's more and more challenging for an operator of these platforms to differentiate through UI, UX alone, because so many content you find now on different platforms, you find the same content. So I think it's I don't know how to address it. It's very further out, but I've seen concepts now where linear channels, you can choose between a bouquet of linear channels and certain apps and bundle that in the individual bundle for yourself when you subscribe to something. And I think that even creates another layer of complexity. So I think for customers or consumers, it gets more and more complex to deal with all of these services. And I don't know what to do about it, but I think it would be interesting to have your thoughts from a technology, but also from a UX UI standpoint. What can you do to improve the customer experience or the consumer experience in that regard?
I think there's a tipping point that's we've come to. There's an enormous number of different proprietary standards being used.
Right.
There's an enormous number of apps that you can subscribe to. There's an enormous number of user interfaces that you can use to watch TV. Is that sustainable? Are we just going to get more and more and more apps and get more and more and more choices of how to find our content? I don't think so. I think it'll probably go the other way. What may happen is, just like going on the internet, there's only one or two places that you go to where you want to find things, right? That's what's happened to internet search. You could predict that perhaps something similar may happen to finding content, broadcast content, linear content on the internet. Is it going to collapse to one or two? Who knows, right? It's very difficult to know. However, what is true is that the more standardized it is, the easier it'll be. All boats will rise, as we say. So, making proprietary technologies now is maybe okay for the next couple of years, but in the end, I think standards will win out.
Yeah, maybe just a comment on this. From a streaming service perspective, I think on the web and on the mobile, this has been sort of solved. I mean, we're dealing with basically one technology on the web. On the mobile, we have two operating systems we have to deal with. So that's pretty easy, I would say. When it comes to the big screen, it's another story. And there it's much more fragmented. Not only it is fragmented in terms of operating systems, so in number of apps we have to develop for the different system. You have Samsung Tizen, LG OS, you have Android, you have Apple TV, and then you have all these probably HTML-based lighter apps you have to provide to lower-end devices. And that's a lot of different technology that you have to put out, and not taking into account like that you have powerful devices where your app will run great, and very, very low-end device where it might lag, so you have to develop a lighter version of your app. So all of that makes, I think, the challenge of being on the big screen pretty high today for a streaming service, especially if you're not Netflix and you have a smaller team.
Yeah, so it's a good challenge. It's both ways. In the deployment side, that you have to be on every screen, on every form and operating system, but also for the customer to find it. So I think both sides are getting challenged. I mean, find the content, but also deploy the content. But Martin, you want to add?
I was going to add that I think that approach to the big screen is one of the key examples of thinking in that second stage of digital transformation. So a lot of the times we see customers who have approached online just from perhaps a small screen perspective, but really building around the big screen is key to thinking digital first. So it doesn't necessarily need to be the case of addressing the smart TV applications is a key challenge, but I think also there's ways of bringing broadcast and streaming together, perhaps with AI and machine learning to bring automated sports highlights, for example, around a sports match. So that's bringing the broadcast and the streaming world together in a way that increases engagement, and I think that helps drive the addressable market.
If I can jump in there, so exactly that's what we've been defining in DVB. So the principle is that you may be watching a channel, but the user has no idea where that channel is coming from. So it's absolutely transparent from a user point of view. They don't have, you can put an icon up if you want, but the principle is that you can pull the antenna out, the program will continue, the linear channel would continue based on the streaming equivalents. There would be a table, if you like, that tells you, well, this is available on this streaming here, even the local version. So, whether you have broadcast, if your broadcast is coming in and out, it allows you to drop back to streaming, but also the other way around. So if you're streaming, if your bitrate is rather limited, then you have the broadcast there. And, we see that from Sky and so on, that they have a backup, which is using the broadcast. So, that's seamless movement from what we already have to streaming. I think what that allows you to do is to move people seamlessly. So they may start off watching something linear, but if you can seamlessly take that user on a journey where they end up half an hour later watching the second episode of the same program, watching the same program from the beginning, watching a related program, a recommended program, what you've done is you've effectively moved them seamlessly from a broadcast environment perhaps into a streaming environment where you can then retain them. If you have to leave, open an app and start messing about with the apps, that's not a smooth experience. So it has to be seamless from that point of view.
It also requires universal ability of rights, right? That you can have it in every use cases from broadcast to streaming for different devices, in-home, out-of-home. And what we learned also today is that direct-to-consumer propositions are built by the major rights holders. So it will be, on the one hand, consumers expecting that they have a universal ability of apps or the content they subscribe to. But on the other hand, it gets not only challenging more to deploy it, but also do you have the rights as an operator to do that, and not only limited. And what we see, or what I see in the industry in the moment, that the rights holders keep all of the seamless rights or the different use cases to themselves and only commission some of the rights to platform owners. And I think that is a really key challenge, that you have a lot of rights available, but with different flavors. So that means you can't treat all of the rights at the library or the broadcast, whatever you own, equally. And I think that's really difficult for the customers to understand, subscribe to the service, that one show they can watch seamless, out of home, different devices, live or on demand, catch up, and the other content they can't. That's
but it's a chicken and egg to some degree, because once that model of seamlessly moving, from linear to non-linear or to IP is there, then you have something to discuss. You have a start point where you can start discussing with your rights holders. Right. I think at the moment, each platform is quite separate, and therefore you negotiate your rights separately. Once the lines begin to blur, I think there's a new conversation that you can then have with your rights holders.
I think that then comes into how you build the service as well, because the complexity is coming from the rights holders and aggregating multiple sets of rights together. But the cloud is where you gain the flexibility to start to implement those different rights. So by approaching that in a way that's programmable, then you can build your service in a way that can represent those rights in a relatively straightforward way, and that I think shifts the problem, which is still going to be a challenge of explaining that to consumers as to what they can do, and perhaps providing the lowest common denominator in given circumstances. But it's a key point, and I think really the flexibility that the cloud enables is key for that.
Yeah. So the one thing maybe which will tip the balance as well is what we start seeing now is devices that look like televisions but have no tuners. So the streaming is the only way that you can watch a TV on those devices. My company Huawei has one for sale. You know, they're in the market now, where your only TV connection, if you like, is your internet connection, and that forces you to then have an out-of-box experience, which is simple. If your out-of-box experience is that you have to download 5 apps before you can even start watching a few of your favorite channels, that's not a great experience. It needs to improve out of the box, because it's not a case that you can just auto-tune anymore. There will be nothing to auto-tune to. So, and I think specifications like DVB-I will allow that to happen. So you can still have some level of basic functionality even without starting on your apps.
Yeah, and by to Martin's point is everything will be deployed in the cloud, and we have done this numerous times, but I think that in the moment it's very tough for consumers to understand the differences and how they can receive the content, and going back to the point where that usability is helping to harmonize that, and so we can watch from one show, start here and continue there. But in the end of the day, I think it's a lot that we need to do from the industry standpoint to fulfill all these expectations on the one hand, but also the consumer must learn a lot what he can do, what he can't do. And I know that the English-speaking markets usually have been a little bit more privileged because the rights are being more harmonized in the markets. But I think, Pierre, you probably can also talk about that firsthand, because you have probably different rights for different languages and for different territories, and then to educate the customer that he can only use it here and not there. And we all talk about cloud deployments and things like that. I think it will take a couple of years before we get to this kind of environment where you can watch everything on every device and at different times and time zones and different languages.
Yeah, well, we have the challenge of having one platform in a country that speaks 4 languages. Our catalog is multilingual, and therefore we try really hard to encourage people, our users, to watch content from another region, so in another language, and this is about increasing our addressable market, so to say, because if we can convince the French speakers to watch German-speaking content with either French audio or French subtitles, then we just make our catalog more valuable overall. And what we realize from our user research is that, in general, there is bad, like content from another region, in another language, has a bad, I don't want to say reputation, but is not as attractive until they try. And if a user watches a content that is interesting, regardless of the language, if a French speaker watches a German-speaking content, then he is sort of locked in a way that he will watch more of those, because that crossing that barrier once it's done, basically you've broken that barrier, and people start to get more content from the entire catalog, and so it's really about how do you make subtitles more attractive, how can you customize them, how can you onboard people in it. So for example, when on Play Suisse, the experience is such that all of the titles are in your language. All of the descriptions, all of the metadata are in your language. And in the end, you can see in the metadata that the content is not in your language, but we don't promote it. And the decision to watch that content has to be made on the type of content, on the category, on the content itself, rather than on the language. And it's the last thing in the user journey that you can basically realize that it's actually in another language, or you don't want it because it's with subtitles.
I think that's a super important point. I mean, accessibility in general. So accessibility for people with needs, but also accessibility from a language point of view. You know, there's an enormous amount of great content out there, but you know, maybe I'm not watching it because I don't understand the language, or perhaps I have other accessibility needs. What we're seeing from the big streaming companies is they are obviously taking accessibility incredibly seriously. And it's not because it's a duty, it's because it retains viewers. It's a commercial decision. And, you know, and I think accessibility sometimes gets a bad rap because, people think, well, I've got to do it, it's compulsory, it's a tax on me to have to do accessibility. Actually, it's time for a fresh look. And if you look at it from the point of view of that it's an opportunity to get a bigger audience, I think the gaming community even is embracing accessibility as a way to expand their audiences. And you know, with accessibility, you really have to do it properly, and you have to do it in a standardized way. That means that, you know, even from a UI point of view, there's work to be done, because every app you go to, the button's in a different place. If you have accessibility needs, it's very, very difficult to find the new button on a new app that you haven't used before. You know, some level for these kind of things, it's not a competitive angle to make an easy subtitle button or whatever. You know, those kind of things could and should be standardized to allow accessibility services to be really universally there, and you can grab new audiences.
I think it's often overlooked because it doesn't have a net promoter score or KPI that you can apply to it, right? You have to have thorough research and user testing that you can prove that that kind of improvement of UX, UI, or improved metadata, especially for not English-speaking countries, really makes a difference, but it takes a long term to prove it internally, that you create stickiness, or you lower churn rates, or you increase the lifetime value of customers.
1/5 of people have the subtitle on, and there's not 1/5 of people who need them.
No.
And we see that at Play Streets as well, because you would usually think that a subtitle in the language of the video is only made for hearing impaired people.
Right.
Well, and you realize it's used much more than the number of hearing impaired people in your market. And that's because there's several use cases. I mean, how many people watch content without the sound, or with very low sound in their bed or somewhere, I don't know, next to, and there's so many use cases, and you have to cater to those users as well. And so suddenly the subtitle in the video language becomes important for everyone.
Localization is an often overlooked topic, and but try to book localization in a moment, you would not find any resources in the market. It's completely occupied by the global giants who are now come to realize and being forced by the EU to localize. So, but I think it's important, not only, as you said, for hearing impairment. So it's used much often that what we think about it. We actually have almost come to an end, but if you want to add something, or you have any questions to the panel, please raise them now.
Might as well dive in as nobody else did. It's for Alfred, really, and the idea of DVBI, where you have this kind of streaming zapping, I mean, it sounds fantastic, but all these broadcasters have spent so long building their wonderful app universes. Once they get you in there, they're looking at doing recommendations. They go through all this fantastic data to keep you. I don't understand the use case for them, why they would want someone so easily to zap out. I mean, it kind of goes against their interest, doesn't it?
Well, you may say that, but when do we stop having new apps? If you fast forward 5 years, how many apps do you think people will use on a daily basis? 5, 10, 15? So if you're channel 30 on the list and you have to build your own app, which is expensive, you need a development team to do it, or you need to outsource that. You need to maintain it. You need to make sure that it works on the 16 platforms, or the 3 or 4 TV OSs. Who knows? The car platforms will become important, so they'll have their own systems. Maintaining an app is going to be expensive. So if you are not in the top few apps, the traffic is going to be very small to you. You may have really interesting content. You maybe have niche content, interesting content that people would like to watch. But if you're not in that top tier of 2, 3, 4 apps that people are using on a regular basis, it becomes a problem. So I think having obviously they're not going to go away anytime soon. The first 2, 3, 4 apps are always going to be a place where they want to try and keep you. But there is, I think, a need for a place where you can go to find other stuff, if you see what I mean. So. And there's nothing stopping the first few apps in having a place there either. You could make a Game of Thrones channel where you capture new viewers. So you go there, it plays episode 1, and you say, well, if you want episode 2, then you have to buy a subscription. But all of a sudden now you've got someone who really wasn't part of your subscription at all. They've happened upon a piece of content they like. They want to see episode 2. They sign up. So, if you can imagine, Netflix had their channel on channel 7 on the list. I would imagine they would pick up a few subscribers by doing that.
If I could just add to that point, I think we're very out of time. Just quickly then. So about how even the bigger streaming providers are embracing advertising. I think that actually creates an opportunity for the smaller providers, because by driving the acceptance of targeted dynamic advertising technology into more and more applications, then I think that actually increases the industry deployment of those technologies, which makes it easier for the smaller providers to come in with a more dip in, dip out model initially to try to capture users. And that decreases the friction to getting some users onto your smaller platform.
Yeah, and targeted advertising, by the way, is one of our latest DVB specifications. So that means you can have targeted advertising based on IP into your linear channel or your IP channel. So that's another way of retaining and monetizing rather than trying to do it within an app.
Yeah. I think we will hear more about advertising this afternoon, also next days or tomorrow, because I think it's now the new way out from this declining subscription revenues. But thank you very much for the panel. I hope you enjoy the rest of the sessions this afternoon and tomorrow. And thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.